Hello everyone. So there's something I've been thinking about a lot lately, something I wasn't sure was a thing until recently, but as a massive fan of horror, the more thought I gave it, the more I started to believe it, and that is, why are old, outdated, low-resolution games scarier than modern high-definition games with good visuals? It's a very strange thing, right? Because my first thought, at least, and I'm sure I'm not the only one thinking this, is that you'd expect games that are better graphically to be scarier because it's closer to real life, the real world. Like, what would be scarier than a fictional world that looks like real life, right? Because that would mean said game doesn't have the limitations of real life, for lack of a better term, and can have any kind of unspeakable horrors it wants to, but simultaneously look as close to real life as we can get in this day and age. Theoretically, that should be the scarier combination, but it's not. Why is that? Initially, I thought games we've played when we were young children were only scarier in our minds when we got older because we're still viewing those games from our child selves, in turn making older games seem scarier when they really aren't. And that definitely is a factor when it comes to fear, but it's not the only factor. I found that when you go back to really old titles, the horror in these games truly does hold up, even as an adult. Silent Hill is a great example for this. Shortly before Silent Hill 2 Remake came out, I played Silent Hill 1 and 2, and those games are legitimately still frightening. See, the low resolution and lack of anti-aliasing really does work in their favor, because when these games look the way they do, it's naturally a little bit hard to make out what some things are sometimes, depending on how many generations back you go. It kind of forces your brain to fill in the gaps with your imagination, which just, as a human being, naturally makes what you're looking at scarier, because your brain is going to see something that appears frightening, determine that it's frightening, and then fill in the gaps with something even more frightening. That's just how the human brain works. I think it's kind of a primal instinct kind of thing. We as humans need to know what we're looking at to determine whether or not something is a threat, because if it is a threat, we don't have time to wait until we can fully make it out, like visually, because by then it might be too late. So your brain kind of just jumps to the worst possible image it can muster up to keep you safe. Another thing that adds to these old games being scary is draw distance. Well, lack thereof, actually. See, developers were heavily restricted by draw distance in the past, which is partially why the fog in Silent Hill exists, because not only is it scary, but it makes it so that by the time you see a threat, it's already close to you. It's already damn near in your face. And they did lean into this back then, like the fog, for example, like I said. But honestly, for the most part in these games, it's not intentional. It was a legitimate restriction that they had to work around, but just so happens to add to the fear, especially if they lean into it like Silent Hill did. And think about it, a modern game with lifelike graphics can jump scare you and whatnot, but they have to be a bit more creative because the draw distance isn't an issue nowadays. Back in the day, it was almost like a natural jump scare. I know that's a little hyperbolic, but my point is that you probably have less time to react to a threat regardless of where it is on the screen back then, just because of the hardware restriction. And don't get me wrong, modern graphics are scary. Games like Outlast and the aforementioned Silent Hill 2 remake scared the living shit out of me, but I think ultimately I've come to the conclusion that retro games or retro-styled games are more effective when it comes to horror. Something these games do that I think is also unintentionally effective is the transition between dark and light areas. It's a hell of a lot less natural, and what I mean by that is like the blend from light to dark is kind of abrupt. Take a look at this level in the first Crash Bandicoot. It's called Generator Room, the only level in this franchise that I find legitimately creepy. Look how dark the shadows are. It looks it looks thick and like suffocating, like you could cut it with a knife. There's little to no transition between light and shadow. It really makes this level feel eerie, like there's something in the pitch black darkness just waiting to jump out at you. It's just another thing that I think would be difficult to emulate with lifelike visuals without it looking kind of odd. Also, side note, but listen to the music for Generator Room in Crash 1. It's legitimately off-putting. Is that creepy, or is it just me? I hope I'm not the only one who thinks this level is fucking scary. And speaking of creepy things in non-horror games, there's a game in particular I want to mention pertaining to that. There's a game called Thrill Kill. Now, the story behind this game is kind of murky. It was a canceled or banned or canceled and then censored and then rated AO or something like that. It was a controversial game. That's the bottom line. This was a PS1 fighting game. I guess it could be debated that it's a horror game, but definitely not in the traditional sense. It's more so just an extremely dark fighting game. And I'm bringing up this game because everything about it genuinely terrifies me. The premise of this game is 10 people get sent to hell after dying, and a god of some kind hosts a competition for them to fight to the death for a chance to be reincarnated. So the game takes place in hell. So the areas are really dark, cramped, dingy looking areas. The background stories of all the characters are really fucked up. Like, so for example, there's a character who's a deranged plastic surgeon that deliberately disfigures his patients when he was alive. There's a character that's a cannibal that literally fights with a severed leg. There's also a character that was a psycho judge, like court judge, that deliberately acquits criminals so that he can find them, torture them, and kill them himself. You get the point. This game is all kinds of fucked up, and its visuals really convey that. The low poly visuals combined with the backstory of it all, and also the violence, just makes this game really off-putting for me. And it's not like violence like necessarily bothers me in games like at all, really. It's just all of it together is just very disturbing to me. I don't know what it is. This game in particular gets to me more than a lot of other games do. If you're interested in learning more about this game, Matt McMuscles has a great in-depth video about it, so check that out. So I've kind of established that I think retro games have a creepier vibe than modern games. But what about modern games that are stylized to look like retro games? Yes, the PS1 styled modern horror game is a trend that has absolutely exploded over the past few years, and I absolutely love it. They have roughly the production quality of modern games. I say roughly because most, if not all of them, are indie games, but maintain the creepy vibes of an actual retro game. I'd be curious to know what game started this trend, actually. If anyone knows, I'd be interested to know what you think it is. But anyway, these games are great. This is a game called Walk. It's a PS1 styled horror game where you're being stalked on your way home by whatever the hell this thing is. It's got some of the classic horror game things like pre-rendered backgrounds, fixed camera angles, but the style is just so good in this game, and it is effective and scary. Saying this game, and many others for that matter, are just PS1 styled is understating it. These games are more than just imitating the PS1 style. Yes, they look retro, but they still have their own unique style outside of that, as you can probably tell from this footage. Like, if you put this game and these types of games alongside an actual PS1 game, they are quite different if you actually just put them side by side. These games get it. And you know, I think these past 5 or so years, people did start to realize the benefit and I guess novelty of retro games, and so chose to start making games like this. And from there, it was just a domino effect. Tons of them started to show up, and instead of it being an overly saturated trend that I got tired of, it became something I never really got tired of seeing, at least not yet. Maybe I'm wrong about this and it's just me, but we are seeing a lot of these games, but so far, I don't think it's oversaturated. I don't think it's to the point of being obnoxious. But you guys can tell me how you feel about that. But yeah, that's about all I wanted to say. I was going to go into RPG Maker games in this video, but that's kind of a different ballpark, so I ultimately decided against it. I might save that for another video though, actually. There are also going to be a lot more examples in this video, but it kind of just felt like padding, so like they weren't quite necessary to drive home my point, so I ended up cutting those two, but hopefully this still came out okay. Let me know if you guys agree with this. Maybe some of you think modern graphics are far scarier than retro graphics. I mean, that wouldn't surprise me. Horror is extremely subjective, after all. What's terrifying to one person might not be scary at all, or even humorous to someone else. So I'd be curious to know where majority of people stand on this. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.